Is the world heading towards another Cold War? The geopolitical climate today has many people wondering, are we on the brink of a new global confrontation reminiscent of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States? In 2021, global military spending hit an all-time high of $2.1 trillion. This signals rising tensions between major powers. The first signs of a budding Cold War are the deteriorating relations between the current superpower, the United States, and the rising challenger to its global dominance, China. There is growing strategic competition between the US and China, which many describe as a new Cold War. Here are some key flashpoints. Trade war. The US has imposed tariffs on over $300 billion of Chinese goods, alleging unfair trade practices. China has retaliated with its own tariffs. This trade battle threatens global commerce. The US seeks to limit China's access to strategic American technologies like semiconductors and AI. It has imposed export controls and barred companies like Huawei. China aims to become self-reliant in tech. Then there is an issue of Taiwan. This self-ruled island is supported by the US but claimed by China. As US-China tensions rise, some fear a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or even a military clash. South China Sea. China claims nearly all of this strategic sea, including parts in Southeast Asian waters. The US rejects these claims and has stepped up naval patrols, risking accidental clashes. Ideological rivalry. As China grows more powerful, it promotes its authoritarian system as an alternative to Western democracy. This ideological divide fuels tensions. As you can see, US-China relations have taken a sharply adversarial turn, setting up conditions ripe for a Cold War-like scenario. In addition to China's rise, we must consider the threat posed by a revanchist Russia. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia is acting increasingly assertive. In 2014, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, sparking outrage in the West. Russia has backed separatist rebels in Ukraine's east, with fighting continuing to this day. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, triggering massive Western sanctions. This war in Europe has dangerously raised tensions between Russia and NATO. Russia has strengthened ties with China, forming a neo-authoritarian bloc to counter the US-led liberal order. Russia regularly threatens its neighbors and tests Western defenses with provocative military deployments near NATO airspace. With Putin seeking to regain Russia's sphere of influence along its periphery, the threat of escalation and miscalculation has risen tremendously in Europe. Now let's consider NATO's role. This US-led military alliance was created to deter Soviet aggression during the Cold War. After the Soviet collapse, many believed NATO would become obsolete. But the alliance has kept expanding eastwards, incorporating ex-Soviet states like the Baltics right up to Russia's borders. Predictably, an assertive Russia sees this as a threat. As NATO welcomes new members like Montenegro, North Macedonia and potentially Ukraine, it fans Russian fears of encirclement. From missile shields in Eastern Europe to NATO military drills near Russia, Moscow feels its security interests are being disregarded. This drives escalatory moves by Russia meant to split NATO and re-establish its buffer zone of influence. So NATO's ostensible defensive expansion is paradoxically increasing tensions with Russia, possibly nudging us towards a new Cold War. Rising tensions between great powers are also evident in massive boosts in military spending and provocative deployments of forces. The US, China and Russia are the world's top 3 defense spenders, accounting for over 60% of total global military expenditure. The US and Russia possess vast nuclear arsenals capable of destroying each other many times over. There are growing fears of a new arms race as landmark treaties like the INF collapse. US and Russian forces regularly test each other's readiness with aerial maneuvers and naval deployment in contested zones like the Black Sea. China is rapidly modernizing its military and projecting power into the Pacific, alarming the US and its Asian allies. Chinese fighter jets regularly breach Taiwan's air defense zone, rehearsing for invasion. Both the US and Russia are building up their military presence in the Arctic as melting ice creates new shipping lanes and energy resources to compete over. As you can see, the massing of military forces and provocative exercises are creating a volatile situation primed for armed confrontation between the great powers. Another key driver of Cold War tensions was the ideological struggle between Soviet communism and Western democracy. A similar ideological divide has now emerged between China's authoritarian system and the democratic West. China touts its one-party capitalist model as superior and wants it emulated across developing countries. This threatens the global democratic order. Faced with domestic crises, the West's open democratic systems are on the defensive. China leverages its centralized techno-surveillance model as better suited to modern governance. As China provides infrastructure loans across Asia and Africa, it exports technological tools of authoritarian control like mass surveillance systems. The West alleges Chinese tech firms like Huawei aid espionage and censorship on behalf of the Communist Party. As a result, China is barred from providing 5G equipment in countries like Australia and Britain. This ideological divide, though not as sharp as during the Soviet era, still drives great power tensions along civilizational fault lines. Finally, the technology domain is becoming a key battleground for 21st-century supremacy. The US and China are locked in fierce competition over strategic fields like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, and semiconductors. Whichever country dominates these spheres could gain immense economic and military advantages. China's state-driven approach to acquiring foreign tech firms and intellectual property makes this an uneven playing field for the relatively open U.S. economy. Export and investment restrictions are being used by both sides to slow the other's tech advances in a proto-Cold War fashion. Emerging technologies are dual-use in nature. For example, AI can enable lethal autonomous weapons. So by racing for tech supremacy, the US and China are effectively militarizing their economies. This technology competition is accelerating great power rivalry in an interconnected world, just as the nuclear arms and space races intensified Cold War dynamics. However, everything above doesn't inexorably lead to Cold War 2.0. There are stabilizing factors and counterarguments we must consider. Strong economic interdependence and trade between the US and China has a moderating effect. Their economies remain too tightly coupled for full decoupling. Transnational issues like climate change incentivize US-China cooperation despite their rivalry. The 2015 Paris Accords show some willingness to work together. Deep cultural, educational, and people-to-people ties between the West and China create intangible bonds that temper hostility. Modern communication technologies and summit diplomacy facilitate leader-level engagement. Biden and Xi maintain periodic contact. Nuclear weapons make full-scale war unthinkable. The Cold War witnessed contained proxy conflicts rather than direct fighting between the superpowers. Russia has limited power and demographics to sustain a global ideological struggle. Its economy depends on energy exports to the West. So the stabilizing influence of economic integration, shared global threats, and the intolerability of war due to nuclear weapons could avert unrestrained confrontation. Weighing all the evidence, I believe the world has indeed embarked on a trajectory that ominously echoes the pre-Cold War period. Deteriorating relations between the major powers across economic, military, and ideological dimensions do not bode well for global stability.